All right, so we're very fortunate today to have a panel that can speak to a little bit different set of issues around smart connected devices and the Internet of Things. And so the goal in putting this panel together was to start to explore some of the governance issues. Because as you start to attach more and more sensors to more and more physical assets, the issue of who controls the data and what you can do with it starts to become incredibly salient. And so to explore that, we have a great panel. So we've got Carsten Becker, Lilian, Corral, Chetan Desai, Suzanne Seitinger, and Geoff Snelson. And they represent a range of both industrial, service provider, and governmental interests. And so I'd actually ask, as a way of starting, if each person could just kind of describe your role in the stack, as it were, of how you think about Internet of Things, well, and where you fit as one of those government entities or industrial managers.
You want me to start?
Please do. We'll just go from right.
So hi, everyone. My name's Suzanne. I'm with Philips Lighting. And we provide an end-to-end IoT-enabled lighting system that really is at the service of cities and private organizations and also home users. So really thinking about lighting as an IoT enabler and enabled system. And we do that in all these different contexts all around the world. Specifically in this context, I'm going to focus on the public connected lighting piece. So thinking about how these 300 million odd streetlights that you've never looked up at, I challenge you all on your way home this evening to actually look up. And you'll notice all these devices out there. There's 300 million of them. Turns out maybe only 2% are connected at this point. And so that presents an enormous opportunity to create a pathway for future IoT capabilities. And that's what we're trying to enable with our new systems.
Yeah, terrific.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm another Geoff. So my role, I'm a strategist for a mid-sized city in the UK. So we're only about 260,000 in population, very close to London. But it's a very fast-moving and dynamic environment. So my role in the stack, I'm learning a lot today, so thank you to all of you who've contributed to my education. My role is to look long-term to the planning of the city's economy, its housing development and growth, its population growth, education, all those aspects of a city, I guess, that you associate with long-term strategic planning, so through to 2050. But I also lead a future city program that's looking at how we can integrate technology into that strategy and bring new solutions to bear. So there's a balance between trying to assemble solutions and capabilities, including a city-scale data hub, which I can describe in some detail, and IoT systems that can help us address strategic challenges, but also at the same time provide a very open ecosystem for innovation, because we're, as a city government, we're interested in just economic activity and value in the city generally. So trying to balance those two things. So my role is as a convener, if you like. I'm not a technologist, as a convener of those interests and helping them address and engage with city challenges.
Great.
Yeah, Carsten Becker from TÜV Nord. We are a TIC company, so testing, inspection, certification. And that's, of course, is one of the roles we play in this IoT world. One thing is to make, well, our business is to make the world safety and secure. Yeah, and so, of course, also we have the aim to make these IoT platforms safe and secure. And we have just seen from Danielle, from GE, how you have to do it to make it a safe platform. Unfortunately, not all these platforms have the same, let's say, quality level. And so we are there to make sure that this is working and do not harm people, because what we see is that more and more safety and security work together. Yeah? In earlier times, it was not a big issue. You just have to look on safety and everything is fine, but today security can also lead to safety. Yeah? So, and the other point is, of course, we are by ourselves active in this environment to build up platforms and to be a part of this. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chetan Desai. I'm with Schlumberger. So in this audience, maybe a short word about Schlumberger. So we are an upstream, largely upstream oil and gas services company, the largest in the world. Lots of geographically distributed operations around the world. A very particular interest. So we are one of these old school industrial verticals, if you will, with lots of opportunity for digital disruption. The industry itself spends about $800 to $900 billion a year in capex. We think that about 30% of that can be disrupted digitally. So we're talking about big numbers. It's a high value industry. IoT is an important enabler. And what we see as some critical drivers is that it is kind of almost imperative for the geographic dispersion of our industry that the big cloud first, cloud only kind of story doesn't quite work for us. So we are advocating a move towards hybrid solutions where, as you heard from GE, the edge is intelligent, the edge is robust, the edge governs operational processes, and the cloud serves in an important advisory capacity. So the move of the general industry to recognize this hybrid pattern is of key interest to us, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues with data in our industry. It's a very data-rich industry, generates lots and lots of data. For anybody that knows about this industry, today actually, Sam was here this morning, some of the largest workloads on the Google Cloud platform happen to be Schlumberger's for subsurface reservoir simulation and characterization. So we are very data-rich, very geographically dispersed, and some peculiar use cases for IoT.
Great, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Lilian Corral. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles. My position was created by our current mayor, Eric Garcetti. So where I sit in the stack is trying to operationalize his vision of data-driven decision-making and government. And then I also say that really what we do as a team is try to set the foundation for a smart city in all of our data work. What that means operationally is we oversee the city's open data program, which has become the launch pin really to a broader data management strategy. It's been the thing that's allowed us as a city to centralize data and see over 1,100 pieces of critical information and understand how they all can actually help drive decision making and be leveraged as an enterprise. And then we also support the expansion and use of citywide analytics as well as data science in the city, which has been very new to public entities. But my team really tries to promote how we think about leveraging data so that it doesn't just get stuck at the publishing phase, but actually gets really brought back into the enterprise and used to drive operations. And then lastly, we also focus on using that data and the data science work to drive our digital service strategy, right? So after things are analyzed, after we have a better sense of how to drive operations or change services, we need to think about how those services are then manifested in some digital form, that the user, the Angelino, is really at the heart of all of our work, and that whatever the research or our findings give us, that it actually then becomes a service that they can interact with the city around digitally. So.
Oh, terrific. So with that, just as sort of setting the stage, I'd like to ask a couple of deeper questions. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of take the lead, and then others might jump in. So this is for Suzanne. So if you think about public infrastructure, and so you just described these 300 million lights, which you probably sold to cities, so you don't own them anymore,
Right.
and yet the goal is to start to instrument them and make them connected, presumably so that you can capture information. Well, how do you think about that data stream, and who governs the rights to use it, and are those rights well understood?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really excellent starting point, Geoff, because one of the things is, so we have all these assets out there, we start to instrument them. Hopefully they then start to generate meaningful data, which is, I think, the first step. I mean, we should highlight that they're maybe not generating that yet. And there's a big task ahead of us to get to the point where we're actually generating rich data sets that have reliable information, reliable data that's coming back to us, whether that's via the cloud or whether that's doing things in the field at the edge. So there's a huge task ahead just to get that going. As we get that going, we're in a little bit of a gray period as well, because the data governance piece might not yet be established because we don't know exactly everything that we're going to be able to do with those data. Now, as we move on to the next level, we have a bunch of actors that come into the mix, because it's no longer just the city or just the person running the platform, the organization running the platform. It's those users of the data that can be entrepreneurs, they can be the platform providers themselves that generate new services in adjacent verticals. They can be civic entrepreneurs who are not doing it for any commercial goals, but they're actually doing it to improve new kinds of services. So as these different actors start to become part of the mix, you need data governance structures that allow each of them to participate and access these data. And Lilian's created the LA Open Data Policy Handbook, which governs and structures a lot of how some of this information or these data can be used and accessed. And really looking at how not only can it be sort of a public resource, but how can you also then use that resource to do a couple different things. You can actually generate new businesses. I mean, new businesses can be spawned from access to this information, and that has to be regulated and enabled. The city itself can create new services. So suddenly you're in partnership with different city departments that maybe traditionally, for example, in our case, we might not have had a deep relationship with, but suddenly we're finding ourselves talking to a public safety department rather than just a public works department. And that's a very different conversation than we'd ever had in the past. And then finally, I think there's an interesting new direction that's also around how cities are comparing themselves to one another. This idea of more generalizable metrics that allow cities to compare different ways that they implement programs, and different standards, like even ISO, the Global Standards Organization, has created both a sustainable city metric as well as a smart city metric with lists of indicators that they're trying to promote, basically to provide comparable data from one location to another, from one city to another, so that best practices can be transferred more easily. So if one city has found a really great public safety approach to addressing certain issues, they're actually tracking it with data that another city might also have, so that if they do decide to apply that best practice, they can over time actually document those outcomes. And if I think about Mayor Garcetti, one of the most exciting, or Mayor Walsh here in Boston, one of the most exciting moments is when they really show which metrics they track on a daily basis. They really look at these metrics, these outcomes that are being generated from the bottom up over time by these new capabilities. And that's sort of the next level even of really enhancing cities and public environments.
So that's really encouraging that there's been an effort to start to grapple with that. So as I think then about some of those governance issues, those naturally start to move into what some of the business models might be. And this question comes out of a call with Geoff. And I ask, what business models should be used to price and exchange IoT data once you've sort of sorted out ownership and access? And how do these differ by levels of application or business model novelty and risk? And you gave a wonderful example, sort of talking about the Wi-Fi versus the open box.
Yeah, before getting on to that, I
Sure.
thought I'd elaborate a little bit on Suzanne's answer around this challenge of providing an environment in which data can be exchanged and managed and governed in a very flexible way from multiple sources. So with our project, we've established a data hub environment. This is through a project with a technology partner, BT, and the Open University, which is headquartered in Milton, Keynes. And it's a data hub in which the core principle is that the data providers keep control of that data. So they retain ownership and set the policies for the use of that data. and then somebody who wishes to use the data. So he has to actually subscribe to those policies and commit to adhering to it. So it's not a system in which the city government is trying to control and manage the data. From what I'm learning today, it sounds as if it truly is a platform which has rules and regulation between the providers of data and the users. So what you'd have on our data hub, if you wish to develop an application, you end up with a data account, and some of the data you wish to access may be open data provided by the city, so you log that, it's no cost, but ultimately it also allows, and we've never got as far as actually invoking this feature of the data, but ultimately it allows you to purchase and price data, such that as part of your account and your application, you'll get some data for free. There may be some data that you do a deal with somebody on, and then finally there may be something that you pay for. And when you're paying as well, you'll also want to be sure, if you're an application provider, that you're getting the right quality data at the right time and so on. So we've started to do some work on sort of service level agreements and that quality control. And in the environment working, I mean, the solutions we're trying to develop or promote, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the economic models, because we're in this sort of bind where until we've deployed things at a city scale and we can understand the economics, we don't really know the value of the data that's going into those systems. But of course, getting the investment to deploy these things at city scale requires people to have at least an inkling of the business value and the business model before they'll commit to investment. So we're mostly still supporting our projects through sort of innovation funding, government grants, and sort of finding corporates and tech companies that have got R&D budgets that find that we've got facilities that they get some benefit from using. So mostly we're involved in risk sharing. And the sort of discussion we were having, Geoff, was that in a context such as that, we as a city may well provide access to our infrastructure and other facilities, because we've got a sufficient belief, and often it does come down to belief, because the economics are so poorly understood, but a belief that it fits with our strategy so well. We're prepared to allow access for free and to take a bit of a risk. Where there are products which are much more commercially understood and where there are multiple providers, we're into a straightforward procurement sort of type system, and we can buy and just as we would do any other product and service. And it's trying to find some way of managing this sort of in-between space where we do that transition from being pretty freewheeling and R&D and spending other people's money often and so the risks with the risk sharing there through that sort of transition to where we've got products where we understand enough to make the investment.
Well, that's a really great perspective, because I was really struck in our setup call. So my next question is for Chetan, if I'm getting that correct or close. And the oil and gas industry is actually fascinating, and I hope people processed the scale of what $800 to $900 billion of CapEx every single year means. And so if you ever go to something called the Offshore Technology Conference, which is in Houston every year, it'll be the closest thing you ever saw to space technology, because you're essentially operating in the most hostile environments on planet Earth, with technology that's highly engineered and sort of highly instrumented. And so the question that really came out of our conversation was twofold. One is, how does the value of the data collected vary sort of by the time and place? Because I think you're in these incredibly harsh environments that are high risk. But also, kind of as a follow-on and an analog to the city model is, as one of the service suppliers, you're often working, so for example, on an offshore platform where somebody like Shell or BP might be kind of the original owner, and yet you're the service provider. So those same data use agreements must have come into play. And then how do you aggregate it, and who owns it, and how can you reuse it? Might be some complex issues. So maybe you could speak to some of that.
Sure, yeah, and I would say simply the complexity is just growing. So we are at the kind of, we are not close to the seventh innings of this game here. No, so just as a short plug, just around the block, and we have a research center And the oil and gas industry outside of itself is not known very much for its technology, but we do all the way from first principles research to now on the digital side, a lot of innovation, and our center manager is here from the Boston Center. So the thing is, I think for us, clearly, and this was my comment earlier about the edge, operational optimization, here you can think about efficiency, productivity, process optimization. This is the quality of the service that we have to offer, the way the plant is running. These are of tremendous value. And so when people talk about the 1% improvement story in these large industrial verticals, the fact is that a lot of that value extracted from the data needs to be near the operational equipment. And so I would say we would attribute a huge part of this potential digital disruption prize close to the edge. And that's where we gather most of this data. We do run the risk, as was commented earlier by Suzanne, that we might gather a bunch of data that actually doesn't create much value also. So here, to the point from earlier this morning about machine learning and AI, we think that the domain competency starts right at the point of identifying what data is worth capturing, right? Today, you almost see this kind of thought process in the industry coming from the technology partners because of the cost of cloud storage, et cetera, coming down dramatically, store all data, and that all data is valuable. Well, the organization of this data, and especially when you do it at the edge, where you don't have access to the cloud, it's very difficult. So just as a data point, fully 70% of Schlumberger's operational footprint cannot access any of the top 3 public cloud providers' compute infrastructure today, 70. So we operate in places where Amazon, Microsoft, and Google don't give us access to their public cloud infrastructure. And by the way, network POPs don't help us because we have very particular issues because oil and gas data is classified as a national resource by many, many countries, that the data is simply not allowed to leave the borders of the country. So if you go to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Indonesia, all of these places would not allow their subsurface data to leave the country. So this is an important challenge. It's not about latency to the cloud. It's a matter of entirely data residency. And it's a little bit beyond privacy and security as the consumer space has solved. For us, we need large at-scale data source storage in country, right? So all of this to say that we see tremendous value near the edge. We need to extract that value at the edge. We see the cloud playing an important role in terms of fleet aggregation, if you will, global insight generation. So all of this we see relevant also. I think the other important part that we talked about a little bit earlier was around the security of this data, right? So we think that many of our, and oil and gas as a vertical is a little bit peculiar in that our end customer, the BPs and Shells of the world, a few decades ago, decided to outsource a lot of their technical operations to service industries like us, right? Wherein they don't retain first principles research today in their organization. So now we come to a point where the service industry in oil and gas is the OEM and the service delivery arm. So knows about the equipment, knows how to use the equipment, and our customer doesn't, right? So technically, when we get into the contractual issues about data ownership between us and the customer, it's going to be interesting that if you did a contractual land grab for data ownership as the customer and just oblige systematically your supply chain to say, I, as the customer, own all this data, you will not extract any value out of it because you don't have the technical competency in your organization, which you outsourced a few decades ago, to mine this data. So we see this happening today in this prevalence around data and data ownership. There will be a contractual land grab, but then on the other side of that will be a realization that some real value has to come out, and only the domain knowledgeable people will be able to extract this value.
That's a really fascinating perspective and very, very helpful. especially this notion, and I think we heard it earlier on the machine learning panel, about where data gets aggregated and the feedback loop to faster learning. So you can already see some of the dynamics play out in oil and gas, and my suspicion is, and perhaps, actually I'll aim at Lilian, maybe you can speak to that. How do you maintain access, if that's a goal, so that you can kind of spread the benefits of that learning around? And then a kind of a follow-on question would be, how do you think about combining data from multiple sources, and then what the licenses are around? Do the end users have to go back and license the original sources, or can they just work with the sort of new derivative feeds? Because these are complex issues when you start to mash weather data and traffic data, and sort of what are the use agreements around that?
Yeah. So it's very interesting to hear always the private sector perspective, because we have to manage data almost as a public good, right? All the data we produce, and this is definitely the vision and the feeling of our mayor, who's really been the original champion of this effort in our city, that data is a public good, and it's an open public good, and so we as a city have to make it accessible to everybody. By way of that, we've obviously stumbled as an enterprise that all of this information actually should have been shared with everybody across the organization a long time ago, and it would have been really useful. It's really useful to solve problems in very comprehensive, multidisciplinary type of ways. So we really see the opening and the sharing of data as something that we have to do. The question of how you monetize it is an interesting one for us as well. I'll just address some of the points earlier, partly because there is a capacity issue, and there is a cost to a lot of the work that we do that right now currently within the organization isn't actually directly allocated. It's coming out of, just out of our own personal budget. But at some point, in order to really manage the enterprise-wide data and to really be able to leverage and extract value from it, and then to be able to share all of that publicly, really has to become a line item and a full vertical within the public organization. And there's really no city, at least in the U.S., that I see that has done that. And and I converse with other cities across the globe, and I haven't seen that either. So it's really important to think about that. In terms of bringing together different data sets, we find that terribly, terribly important. If you don't combine all these different data sets, then you're actually missing a lot of the value. And that's where actually obviously the emergence of AI and some of the potential value of AI in the future is going to be for us in being able to bring in all of our data sets together. I at least talk about, we have about 1,100 plus data sets that we manage publicly. And they're still siloed, if you will, because the current infrastructure is such where every single data set is separate, and being able to bring all of that together into a space and being able to extract value, through AI or machine learning is going to be very critical. The one thing I say to bringing in different data sets that I think is really important to keep in mind, at least for us as an organization, we've avoided placing value on data and saying this is a more important data set than others, because we actually find across the enterprise different examples where something that was not really valuable last year becomes really valuable today. And what's really interesting, I'll use Philips as an example, and street lighting data, since we're on the since Suzanne's here with me, is we are now using our street lights to actually, they're solar powered, they're generating power, they're actually charging vehicles in different parts of the city, and they're actually returning energy back into the grid. We would not be able to have, I think several years ago, we may not have categorized street light locations, like street pole locations or street light data, as really valuable. Today, when we're actually generating energy out of it that is enough to actually go back into our grid, it's extremely, extremely valuable. And the same, we have examples across that, for example, with when we wanted to do an expansion of fiber across the city with Google. All of a sudden, having that data readily accessible became really, really useful. And so, so we've hesitated in prioritizing data. What we really are trying to do is just make all of the data discoverable and accessible to the degree that we can, and really promote a culture of sharing, and really promoting also the use of each other's data to solve problems. Because it's not, city challenges are very multidimensional, and you're not going to solve crime just by looking at crime data, and you're not going to solve it just by looking at like economic or socioeconomic indicators, right? You're going to have to think of things like the built environment, like street lighting. You're going to have to think about, you know, the permeability of streets, even things like, concentration of trees or not. All of those things are actually factors in the built environment that cause a lot of social challenges and can address a lot of social challenges. And so we really think it's critical to be able to bring all of that information together into a platform that is very interoperable, that can still give everybody the freedom to use whatever tools they want to analyze all of that data, but that really makes everything much more accessible from their own perspective and more discoverable.
I just had
Please do, yeah.
thought on this issue of data wrangling. You know, so in our industry we have some really long life cycles for our equipment, right? So typically field installed useful life of our equipment is like 15, 20 years plus, right? So the whole idea that the brown field and the green field for IoT are somehow going to come together, and in particular the data from these two spaces. There is, even with the $900 billion of capex a year, there is not enough capex to go replace that installed fleet, right? So the brownfield is going to exist for the next 20 years, right? And the point there is, today for equipment health, which is like a very big use case for industrial verticals, prognostic health management as a use case for IoT, probably 60-70% of the time of data scientists in our organization goes into data wrangling.
Still.
This has nothing to do with development of ML algorithms or anything of the kind, right? So this time, and largely driven by the inability to fuse data from all these different sources, the legacy equipment, the new equipment, et cetera, is a significant problem. And it's not going away anytime soon. And for now, while we have ML capabilities that deal with discovering, so, you know, around unstructured data, some things, we've not really found an easy solution from anybody in the marketplace. And I'm putting it out there in this audience because maybe there will be solutions. That's a big gold mine waiting for somebody to tap. You know?
Well, and it really, what you're raising too is the idea of how these platforms are extensible or not, and what interfaces will actually emerge that enable people to add new things over time, and the different timelines of those things, because they all, I mean, I can relate to your long time horizons. We have the same issue, and it needs to run. It needs to run for that long. And in fact, part of the promise of the newest technology is you don't have to go out and maintain and send crews and do all this manual labor. But yet, if you're adding things that suddenly have a completely orthogonal timeline to them, because they're environmental sensors, then suddenly you're back out there in the field in a bucket truck. And so it really is at that level, and you need to think about that. And in order to generate those meaningful insights, you're going to have to address these interfaces, and that will enable a lot of new possibilities.
About the who owns the data, we face the issue that we have a really huge amount of data and not able to access it or to use it because we never ask for permission, and that's a big issue, I believe. And so from today on, we really put always in we would like to use this data. Yeah, which makes it not so easy because normally people want to know for what you want to use it, and sometimes you don't even know for what you can do with it, and so that's a big issue when we look on our data, as we are a company which is 150 years old. Yeah, so there's a lot of data over centuries, which we cannot use and not access.
We worked on a survey with the economists, and what they found, they interviewed citizens in 12 cities all around the world, and when you ask someone generically, can I use your data, they say no. And then when you ask them, if I cut your commute in half, will you let me use your data, they say yes. Which makes sense, of course, but it's exactly your point that you don't know up front necessarily how it's going to be useful, and it may only be useful in the aggregate or with some other data set in parallel. So that's definitely something that you see all the time.
We talk about that in terms of like the data literacy of the general population, but even our own employees, right? And so this notion that you have to explain to me what you're going to do before I give you data has been something that we've really been trying to sort of chip away at, because the reality is you're going to do real data science work. You don't know yet. You start to explore. You may have some questions, but you don't know what you need or exactly what you're going to do. And government bureaucrats really want to know, like they want to create the data sharing agreement and explain the use and the intended purpose, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been really trying to work across our enterprise, if you will, to really do that data literacy and education work so that folks are more receptive to really sharing, and especially sharing with the public, which is now that private data that we don't publish, so that it makes it a lot easier for others to build applications to do research and design, et cetera.
Well, I was really heartened or horrified, I'm not sure which, to discover that this problem of data munging and data wrangling doesn't sound like you think it's getting better. And so there's clearly an opportunity, although I do teach data analytics and science, and I make the students go ahead and get primary data, specifically, A, to make it real, and B, to teach them that 70 or 80% of the work was done in that process before they ever got to run a single regression or run any machine learning algorithms on it. So I think I'll keep doing that. So Carsten, maybe you can take the lead on this, because I think we've heard this notion of governance in platforms earlier as really an important function. And if you think about the data itself, because that's sort of the topic of the panel, how do you think about the mechanisms that you put in place or the sensors to know when misbehavior is taking place? Because you mentioned that you spend a lot of time thinking about security, and I would think that would be a really important issue as we start to increasingly instrument things. So maybe you can kind of walk us through a little of thinking about the sensing and sort of how to encourage good behavior, but also how to detect it when things go wrong.
I think one big issue is that many people totally underestimate the risk of not secure data. Yeah? I believe many people think it's only something about data privacy, but just imagine, we heard from GE the example of Stuxnet. There are many other examples where you can see how much it can harm somebody when somebody is doing something wrong with data. Yeah? Just imagine when you think about an IoT platform for elevators. I don't know, in the US you maybe have 3 million. When you have these smart elevators, just think about all of these smart elevators sent down to the basement on a Friday evening because somebody just wants to do it. That would create a really big issue, yeah, to get the people out of these elevators. And of course, when it comes to nuclear power plants and when it comes to trains, then this problem gets even bigger because people can just die. Yeah. For a company like us, it's always, let's say, a good thing if a problem is big, yeah, because then regulation normally comes into the game, and for us, of course, it's part of the business, and our business is much easier when regulation is there. So we, by nature, love regulation, but leave that beside, and when you really look on how this can harm people, it's very important to look how you can make it secure. When you also look on what I think we heard it 3 hours ago, that trust is a new currency. There's, I think, only a single chance you have. If you run a platform and you mess it up, there is no second try, and I think you can close the platform. The best way to avoid that, I believe, is to make it secure by design. I think we just heard it. Yeah, you have to have secure elements. You have to really encapsulate the access to data. You have to have secure sensors, and you have to have a redundancy in your systems to make sure that even if something is not work as it should, that something else can take over and make sure the system can still operate and run and so on. Because we are not far away from the time that, of course, these systems are self-running systems. There is nobody who can take over, yeah, or there will not be. Look at the Google cars with no driving wheel. Yeah? So what are you doing if it's not working? And so I believe the design is the technical design is a very important part of making a system secure. If you don't have the financial power like GE, it's probably a big issue, yeah, because with every software update, you again make the system unsecure, because there's new code coming to the system. You have to make sure that you do not make a secure system unsecure. And so, of course, from our point of view, what we are doing is that we're combining these security and safety aspects, and that we look on these kind of systems. So, of course, a solution would be just to regulate it this way, that you have to have somebody looking on the systems and make sure that the architecture is secure, but also that running systems are secure and keep secure. Yeah, and at the end, you have to do certifications and inspections and stuff like that.
So maybe just one more additional point. So I agree with the security by design concept. I think for me the important thing for the industrial verticals is, and in particular in oil and gas, we see this quite relevant. I think in other industries too. We are not the only provider whose equipment is in that installation. So security is only as good as the weakest link, and you can advocate for defense in depth, but the point is that a weak actor in your ecosystem compromises the whole thing, right? And if it's not your equipment, and there are very few companies that can end-to-end create certification organizations, provide the V&V verification services and things like this on a commercial basis, while their primary business interests are in their equipment or their service, right? So I would suggest that for third-party interoperability in regards to security, the emergence of operations integration standards by industry are a critical point for security. Otherwise, ours is one of the industries which doesn't have very robust industry-wide operational integration standards, right? And we are advocating for them aggressively now from our position of leadership in the industry, because we see not just from the commercial perspective, but now from a security perspective, with the advent of IoT, that minus having this framework in place, it's going to be really, really difficult to ensure true security on the OT side. On the enterprise IT side, parts of those challenges have been solved, but on the OT side, for where it comes to ICS, when it comes to other aspects of operational technology security, the emergence of these operational integration standards are critical.
I mean, on the city side, or in a public government situation, there's been a similar discussion around smart cities, where for a long time there was this idea that it would be one singular platform and everything would roll up to this centralized control room, and somehow magically at that point there would be someone pulling all the levers and we would get the fully optimized city. And yet, what turned out that didn't really connect with actually the vision of delivering reliable end-to-end services in critical areas. So in public safety or in traffic management or any of these areas, these verticals, where you need to guarantee that no accidents can happen, that nothing can go wrong, the idea of just sort of aggregating everything up and sort of losing track of who's in charge at what level and at which handoff point, that vision of the smart city has really fallen apart. And in a way, I think it's good because as an urbanist, as a city dweller too, I think it sort of generates a very monolithic view of what kind of environment you want to live in. But I think the equivalent, I mean, the reason it fell apart is really because people wanted to guarantee really high levels of service within different domains and then aggregate at the appropriate levels where it actually makes sense, rather than just sort of in general assume that everything can connect at every level. And I think we're having much more sophisticated conversations about where these connection points should happen in these stacks.
Lilian, you must have some.
Yeah, no, I would agree. In fact, I mean, I use the framing of the city as a platform, just loosely in our presentations, and talks about the work that we do, partly because we see the city really as a physical space where these things can come together, and it's really a networked approach, very much what we've talked about all day. But what we have to guarantee are some rules, some frameworks and governance that allows all of those things to potentially play together, right? And that at some point, the data, public and private, from all of these sensors can really connect to each other and be normalized in a way where there's value. And I think Suzanne's right. Like at the appropriate level, that's sort of being worked out. And I think, I know in Los Angeles, for example, we're working on an initiative with USC to develop what they're calling I3, which is an IoT data integrator. The idea, again, being a platform, but more loosely something where the IoT sensors are discovered, the data is aggregated at a permissions level, right? So the city dweller, the entity, whether it be our bureau or police department or the city, we say what we want to share, how we want to share it into that platform, and then the data gets normalized and standardized so that it can be developed upon. So that loose configuration, but yet organized chaos, if you will, I think is the way to go, because at the end of the day, the biggest thing we're seeing is that we're all human beings. And a lot of this, as much as the technology is definitely not there, I totally agree with that comment, and we encourage the technology to get there because it would make our jobs really easy. I think at the end of the day, it's just a human issue. It's about trust, and that's very much a human feeling, and it's about all of these different companies willing to share information and feel like they still have control over their own proprietary code. And it's about all of these organizations feeling comfortable that their data is going to be used in a way that's comfortable to them, and they define it. And so I think it's going to have to be a networked approach, because there's very much a lot of humans at the end of at the end of it all who really want to feel comfortable and engaged in some way as this is all evolving. And that's probably what's going to make it really sustainable as well. So.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. So I think we're at a stage. I have more questions, but I'd like to give the audience a chance since we have such an interesting and diverse set of perspectives here.
First off, thanks for all the perspectives. I mean, really a lot there. I did have a question, though, particularly on the Smart City Ventures, is again how you get these different initiatives going. Because you're saying, hey, we need funding for these types of sensors. And people ask, what do you use it for? And you say, we'll get back to you. I mean, it's really tough to get funding that way. So, I mean, what is it? Is it like partnerships with solar panel, vendors? Or, how is it that you get these initiatives funding when you know that a lot of the value only comes later and only comes when you start to aggregate the data?
There's a variety of ways in which we address that. I mean, there's some areas, for example, transportation, where we've had a very clear strategy of trying to amass as many means of aggregating mobility information across the city and information about timetabling and bus occupancy and so on, where initially, on each individual sort of data feed, if you like, there's not we don't understand the economics, as I was saying earlier, but we know that if we can manage to combine them. So in those instances, we sometimes will fund things ourselves or draw in sort of innovation funding to help create that rounded picture. In other cases, so that's a sort of strategic approach where we've got a vision of what we want and we start trying to pull in the pieces and ultimately achieve a goal and sometimes subsidise that. In other cases, when we're approached because of the infrastructure we have and I guess the profile we get with people with individual projects, and sometimes we'll just want to have a project going because we're interested in momentum and activity and bringing data into the system. So we'll support something like that, even though it may not fit with the strategy. But generally, in terms of the time we spend, we try to have that strategic vision and focus so that we can test opportunities against that bigger picture.
Any other on that?
I'd just say, I think what you're sort of talking to is just this notion that we're still, in a lot of cities, especially American cities, I'll speak for, in this kind of pilot phase. We do a lot of pilots, and then when are we really going to get to scale? And I think part of the challenge is we're all really just budget constrained, but the biggest, I think, success factor is always when the pilot is really tied to a real strategic need for the city. And it's very practical, fairly obvious, but it goes without saying. At the same time, we always get a lot of vendors who want to do like really nice, shiny things. And when you want to do really nice, shiny things, it's like someone will say yes. No one will say no to some cool idea that you bring to them. Now, then when you want them to invest in it, it really has to be tied to like the strategy, because especially in American cities, I think you'll see that our budgets are really tight and they're going to continue to get tighter. And unfortunately, we just don't have the capital to do a lot of these things. So it's going to be a slow wave in which we're replacing infrastructure with new, modern, innovative, smart infrastructure. And if you can plug into that, that's going to be the fastest way to get to scale, as opposed to initiatives that are really cool but not essential to the city operations. That's just a word of caution.
And what I find interesting about it is I think that cities are shifting their perspective a little bit from just approaches that only focus on optimization to approaches that focus on building new things or actually changing services. So kind of rethinking, not just optimizing the service the way it's always been, but actually looking at the core problem, like you were saying, and then coming up with a different way to address that. And then that's a whole other discussion you're having.
I think maybe just one comment, right? I think even if you go out of the public sector to the private sector, there's actually, for IoT, there was an interesting study recently, or survey recently by Cisco. I think they published it in May or something. About 26% of IoT projects across 6 industrial verticals, energy was one of them, actually progressed successfully past a proof of concept stage. 26%, right? Yet 65% of those people, and these are both business owners and IT owners in these organizations, about 2,000 of them that got surveyed for this thing, about 60 to 65% of those people surveyed did say, we learned something from the failure of the other 75%, and that from a strategic kind of North Star where we see an efficiency or productivity play, while this POC from IoT was deemed not successful, the learnings that we got and our desire to continue to invest within our enterprise to find those pots of gold still exists, right? But all that to say, today, a lot of initiatives in IoT are not moving past the POC stage because there are difficult problems in every enterprise that are being tackled, right? So it's how to find funding for those things, even in the private sector, is an important challenge.
So I think that's a great place, and I'm just going to offer just a closing comment. So, obviously we have this mix of public and private, and what I'm struck by earlier is the degree to which this edge intelligence turns out to be critical, and you can't always assume everything will be cloud, and that will be true in the public sector as well as the private. And the other is just the degree to which the problems that are being faced by organizations are so similar. So please thank our panelists. That was great.